Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'd like to talk about corruption in Zimbabwe and bad governance. The documentary by Al Jazeera has Zimbabweans, and rightly so too, sitting down and paying attention to the issue of corruption and mismanagement. But I think sometimes we have failed to appreciate that what Al Jazeera is exposing here has its genesis. What we are seeing is only a snapshot of the rot. Corruption in Zimbabwe started way back in 1980, if not beyond that. And I would like you to listen to Dr. Simba Makoni in a recent interview with Trevor Ngube, explaining where and how corruption started in Zimbabwe. Listen to this.
So we've touched, Simba, on the issue of who we have become, the corruption. And the question I want to ask you is, when did we become so attached to material things like cars, many cars for ministers, big houses, the big convoy that the president and everybody else has? Where did that come from? Is that who we've always been?
Business presenter, stop saying actually or basically. You know, in the middle of a sentence, well, basically this, and well, actually, the.
I would say yes, Trevor. I recall very clearly that when we came into office in 1980, we inherited Ian Smith's systems. And Ian Smith's ministers drove Peugeot 504s. They drove themselves from home to work in their Land Rovers and all in kinds. Most of them were farmers. They parked their Land Rover and then they used the government vehicle when they were at work with a chauffeur. When they finished at night, they packed them and they took theirs to go home. Within the month of our coming into office, Prime Minister Mugabe then directed that every minister be issued with an E-class Mercedes-Benz. And the Peugeot 504s were retired to permanent secretaries, and the deputy ministers who then took over. We can also look at many other things, small they may appear at the time. Let me hazard that even at that point, Enos Nkala was our Minister of Finance. I don't think we knew what budget we inherited from Ian Smith when the decision was taken to buy those E-class fleets for the ministers. So the material affection for material things has always been with us. And the differentiation also, even going back into the camps, Zemashefu, Neze, my comrades, Makada, were not the same. So much so that even today, when the so-called Minister for Presidential Affairs or Provincial Governor, as they were, goes to Bubi or Binga, they will be served separately and differently from the other people. The avarice grew as we began to exploit the opportunities of office. When I was in the government, the minister was allocated one vehicle that they kept, which was the sedan they used in town. If you needed to go off-road, then your ministry hired off-road vehicles from the CMED, and you were charged for it. Now a minister will have an average of 4 vehicles in his forecourt, all at government's expense.
So the leadership modeled the wrong kind of behavior, and that kind of behavior permeated all across our society. Our CEOs, like you're saying, heads of parastatals and so forth, modeled from the top.
Indeed. Indeed. I made a passing reference that we have CEOs who will buy themselves a luxury car when they can't pay wages at the end of the week or end of the month. This has been so entrenched in our psyche, this showing off, as if you are a different person. You're breathing different air from those who don't drive Prados and Land Cruisers, from those who don't drive Jeep Cherokees.
I'll stop there. He goes on to describe other things, but I just want to focus on that aspect of it. This is a serious problem, and one that has gone for years, for the last 43 years. What sometimes people forget here is that Robert Mugabe inherited the biblical 7 fat cows. And he was able to use some of that wealth to buy loyalties from his followers. You know, these started with the cars, and then houses, and then allowances, and God knows what else. And with time, the economy started to suffer. And therefore, then by the time Mugabe was booted out of office in 2017, the 7 fat cows had all but disappeared. The economy was already in serious trouble. And so Mnangagwa has had to dig deeper and deeper to keep this culture of patronage going. And what we are seeing with the looting of diamonds and gold, lithium, is a continuation of the corruption and the looting that started way back in 1980. We had more resources then, now we haven't. So we've got to dig deeper. We've got to go into the nation's gold and silver to maintain this culture, to keep up with the expenditure. What I want many people, I think, should remember here is that when the government of national unity was formed in 2008, Mugabe used this same mentality of bribing, of patronage, to bribe the incoming opposition and buy their loyalty. Anyone who understood what the GNU was about will tell you the primary purpose of the GNU was to implement the democratic reforms to stop ZANU-PF rigging elections, among other things. But probably that's the most important thing. We had just gone through the 2008 elections in which ZANU-PF blatantly cheated in the March vote by stopping the count at a critical point and then ordering a recount, in which the MDC is 73% of the vote. At least Morgan Tsvangirai, 73% of the vote, was whittled down to 47%. Just enough to allow the runoff. And then during the runoff, used wanton violence to ensure that Mugabe won the runoff. That alone, what happened during the 2008, would have focused anybody's mind in saying, well, the government of national unity's primary purpose is to make sure that that doesn't happen ever again. In other words, implement the democratic reforms to stop the blatant cheating and the wanton violence. And yet, after the 5 years of the GNU, not even one token reform was implemented. Why? Mugabe bribed Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends to forget about the reforms. Just as Mugabe had bribed Dr. Simbama Kone and his colleagues soon after independence, because Mugabe's cabinet was one of the most useless cabinets in probably human history. It is no exaggeration that Margaret Dongo at one point, in sheer frustration, dismissed the ZANU-PF MPs and ministers and so forth as vakazi va Mugabe, Mugabe's concubines, because of the way none of them ever stood up to Mugabe. Even at the peak of the Kukura Wundi, something that everybody would have said, wow, this is really terrible. You know, this is a war declared on defenseless civilians for no other purpose other than to force ZAPU to capitulate, give up its party ambitions, force them to join ZANU-PF, and clear the way for the imposition of the de facto one-party state. None of the cabinet at the time stood up and said, no, this is not right. Of course, Margaret Dongo's observation that there were no more than Mugabe's concubines, voiceless, powerless, was apt. But to come back to our problem of this patronage that has gone out of control, this is where it started. Mugabe bribed the MDC during the GNU, so they failed to implement even one meaningful reform, not even one meaningful reform during the GNU. Right now, the opposition is participating in these elections, although there is all the evidence, the mountain of evidence showing that these elections are going to be rigged. Indeed, some of the opposition leaders have admitted that it is absolutely futile participating in these flawed elections. I have quoted Tendai Biti in the past, and I've also quoted David Coulthard. David Coulthard in his book went one step further and explained why the opposition keeps on participating in these flawed elections. And he admitted that it was because of corruption. The opposition had not implemented even one meaningful reform during the GNU because ZANU-PF bought their loyalty, their blind loyalty. And Robert Mugabe offered the opposition a few gravy trains to entice them to participate in flawed elections. And David Coulter had admitted in his book that was the attraction. Neither opposition side would want to withdraw for fear that if they withdraw, the other half will participate and win those few seats that are on offer. It's just that now, with the country getting poorer and poorer, Mnangagwa is said to dig deeper and deeper to find enough wealth to continue this political patronage system. And so now he is selling the nation's treasures, gold, diamonds, lithium. Some of the minerals he's selling them before they're even mined out. The IMF and the World Bank have warned against the practice of selling a nation's mineral wealth that is in the ground. And that is it. And yet that is exactly what this ZANU-PF government has been doing. It has signed many contracts with the Chinese, selling the country's platinum or lithium minerals before they're even mined. So the future, the country's future, is being sold in advance. And those that are able to mine, like gold and diamonds, he is smuggling them, the gold. And he is getting a cut of the proceeds. And the Mafia masterminds behind it are the ones who are actually getting the lion's share of it. But what must be understood here is that the opposition are in it. They are now part and parcel of the corrupted institutions in Zimbabwe. We sometimes talk of ZEC officials being corrupt, the police, the judiciary. What we should not forget is that the opposition itself has been corrupted too. There is no doubt that the opposition had the opportunity to implement the democratic reforms during the GNU, and they failed to implement even one. There is no doubt that the opposition should not be participating in these flawed and meaningless elections, but they do participate because they are after the few seats that ZANU-PF is offering them, Mnangagwa is offering them. The most important message I would like people to take home today is that corruption did not start now. Corruption has got its genesis way back to 1980. In fact, if the truth be told, corruption started way before the country's independence. This is an article that was written by Stuart Doran in The Strategist. And he was writing about the post-Robert Mugabe government of President Mnangagwa. This is what he said. The new regime can be viewed from different angles, but the nub of it is this. There is a recognition that the economic fiasco of the last 20 years was suboptimal. But Emmerson Mnangagwa and his fellow travelers will burn the house down if they feel it necessary. Make no mistake, their will to power is every bit as intense as Mugabe's, as is their belief that they own the country's choicest fruit by right of conquest. There is no comprehending Zimbabwe without an appreciation of that mentality. Yet many fail to get it because they don't read the country's history. In 1979, at the height of the struggle against the white rule, a diplomat who mixed frequently with Mugabe and his other leaders, and the other leaders of his party, observed that ZANU-PF does not seem to attach much importance to the destruction caused by the prolonged war. They said they were content to see Zimbabwe totally demolished if that was the price to be paid for preventing others from ruling it. That attitude has not changed an iota. Notwithstanding the passage of 40 years, the Mugabe and Mugabe's departure. After all, the men who now rule wielded his hatchets for most of that period. End of quotation. I think this is something that most Zimbabweans fail to appreciate. ZANU-PF is willing to burn the whole house down. Mnangagwa and company are selling the country's prized jewels for a song just to stay in power. The country's future is being sold for a song just to stay in power. They will do anything to stay in power. That is the reality we are dealing with here. And the very fact that we've got an opposition that is sold to that mentality has compounded our situation. The opposition will participate in these elections, although they know the process is flawed. There is overwhelming evidence that these elections are going to be rigged. And yet, Chamisa and company are determined to participate. They are after a share of the spoils of power. Even those who do not win any seats in these coming elections, Mnangagwa has seen to it that they participate and they get rewarded. That is why he created this pollard. He wants to see as many candidates contesting so that he can turn around to the world and say, well, Zimbabwe is a healthy and functioning multi-party democracy. Look at the number of opposition parties who are participating. The few, they will be rewarded with a few gravy train seats, the few MP and senators. The losers of the presidential race will be invited into pollard and be rewarded with cars and other privileges. Proceeds from the looting of the diamonds, gold, selling cheap of the country's lithium and so forth. Mnangagwa is selling everything the country has just to stay in power. And part of the process, he has got to bribe the opposition to give the impression Zimbabwe is a healthy and functioning democracy. And the opposition are participating to get their share of the loot. They don't care that these elections are rigged. These elections are flawed. These elections will never produce any meaningful democratic change. They know it. If the opposition, MDC/CCC, wanted free, fair, and credible elections, they would have implemented the democratic reforms during the GNU of 2008 to 2018, because that was their golden opportunity to do so. In the GNU, they did not have to ask ZANU-PF to implement reforms. They were. That is what GNU stands for, Government of National Unity. They were part of that government. And SADC, to be fair to them, they did push Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends throughout the GNU, reminded them of the need to implement the democratic reforms, but they were ignored. Many Zimbabweans out there have failed to appreciate that the GNU was primarily to implement the democratic reforms. And yet not even one meaningful reform was implemented. And it was not, I repeat, it was not SADC's fault. It was because Mugabe had bribed the opposition to forget about the reforms. During the GNU, the later part of the GNU, it was quite common among ZANU-PF circles to hear them boasting that MDC will never implement any reforms because they've learned to enjoy the benefits of being on the gravy train. They will not rock the boat. I think the failure by ordinary Zimbabweans to realize what was going on here is at the heart of the country's failure to resolve this problem. It's over 10 years since the GNU, the end of the GNU. Enough time for the people to have realized what was going on. They have the benefit of hindsight to say, no, something went terribly wrong during the GNU. And not to be sucked into another election, participating in these elections, not knowing that they are being used. There is nothing to be gained by participating in these 2023 elections. ZANU-PF is rigging these elections. The opposition are participating, knowing fully well that the elections are flawed and that participating will only give ZANU-PF legitimacy. But most important of all, they also know that ZANU-PF is giving away a few seats to entice the opposition to participate. It needs legitimacy from the participation of the opposition. And that's why they are participating. So it is imperative for the ordinary Zimbabweans to realize that the opposition here has been bought and is no longer interested in reforms and free and fair elections. And to keep on pretending that Chamisa and friends are fighting on the ordinary person's corner is the most idiotic thing we can do. After 43 years of rigged elections, we should come to our senses and saying this insanity must stop. It is insanity. We can't keep on hoping that we will have meaningful change when we know the process itself is so flawed. There is no chance of any meaningful change. How can you have free, fair, and credible elections when you don't even have a verified voters roll? How can you have free, fair, and credible elections when you do not have a free public media? When ZANU-PF is able to say 3 million people in the diaspora, we are denying them the vote, for no other reason than that ZANU-PF knows that the chances are those people in the diaspora blame ZANU-PF for their plight, and therefore then are not likely to vote for ZANU-PF. And in this case here, it's compounded by the fact that ZANU-PF knows that if they were to be given the vote, while the party could rig the process within the borders of Zimbabwe, outside Zimbabwe, it may not be that easy for the regime to rig the process. It cannot threaten, it cannot bribe, and it cannot rig the result itself. And for those reasons, they've decided to not grant Zimbabweans in the diaspora the vote. This process is so flawed, is so utterly meaningless, that the only meaningful position anyone can take is to denounce it, and denounce it now, not to have to wait until the voting is done and the results are announced and then you start denouncing. It's too late. You denounce it now, and you demand the implementation of the reforms. Chamisa and friends only pay lip service to reforms. They had the opportunity to implement those reforms during the GNU. They failed to implement even one. Now they pretend they are calling for reforms when they know ZANU-PF has got the majority in parliament, and SADC has no role to play in it. And most important of all, ZANU-PF knows that as long as it continues to offer the opposition a few gravy train seats, they will participate regardless how flawed the process gets, regardless how violent the process gets. And as long as they keep on participating, Mnangagwa feels he has got a fair chance of turning to the world and say, no, Zimbabwe is a healthy and functioning democracy. Look at the number of opposition politicians are participating. Why would they participate if the process was flawed? Last week here, he penned an opinion where you were saying the West should not impose their democratic standards on Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has got its own standards, as if to say the right to a meaningful vote depends on which part of the country, of the world you are from. That is a universal right. It doesn't matter your color, the color of your skin, your gender, what tribe you are from. That is a fundamental right. It's like the right to life. You cannot subdivide it and say, well, if you are black, you're entitled to 5 extra years or 5 years less than anybody else. You are a member of the human race. You're entitled to the same right. The right to a meaningful vote cannot be subdivided. Mnangagwa is selling the country cheaply. What we are seeing in the Al Jazeera gold mafia is a regime that is so desperate to stay in power that it is now selling the nation's most precious resources for a song to generate enough money to be able to bribe the ZEC officials, the police, the opposition to participate in these flawed elections, and so that ZANU-PF can stay in power. The only meaningful thing we can do now is reject this flawed election process and force ZANU-PF to accept another new GNU, which will then be tasked to implement the democratic reforms designed to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. Stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections so that the country has got free, fair, and credible elections. That is our best chance of having a competent and accountable government. Then we can reset our political system. We can now say resources of the country should be used for the benefit of the nation and not for the benefit of the few, as we are seeing now. What we are seeing now is a system in which Mnangagwa is selling whatever he can lay his hands on for a song, just to keep himself and ZANU-PF in power. He is sharing some of the spoils of that, selling cheaply those resources, with the opposition buying their support, their participation in this flawed process. The idea that we have got a meaningful, competent opposition is nonsensical. The evidence of the last 23 years shows that the opposition, for all it had pretended to be the movement for democratic change, has not implemented even one meaningful democratic change, even when they had the golden opportunity to do so, because they were bribed by ZANU-PF. And they are participating in these elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy for a share of the spoils of power. The opposition will want to pretend that they are outraged by all this gold mafia documentary. The truth of the matter is, Tendai Biti, Nelson Chamisa were in the 2008 to 2013 GNU. And during that time, yes, the gold smuggling was not a serious problem. But the biggest problem then was the diamond looting. During the GNU, the looting of the diamonds in Marange and Chiazwa was in full swing. Tendai Biti and all the other MDC leaders knew about the looting of diamonds in Chiazwa and Marange, and they did nothing about it. Why? Because they were part of the system. They were enjoying the benefits of being in the dictatorship. They were getting their cut. It was that cut that stopped them implementing the democratic reforms. Simba Makoni was earlier on talking about this E-class Mercedes-Benz. When Morgan Tsvangirai and his fellow MDC friends were sworn in as ministers, they also got their E-class Mercedes-Benz. When you're sitting in that new, brand new E-class Mercedes-Benz limousine with his rose-tinted glasses, you see the world differently. Just as Simba Makoni and his friends, ZANU-PF friends, saw the world differently. The idea that they will implement the reform was forgotten. That was the reason why MDC failed to implement even one token reform. And from there on, they were a totally different animal. Nelson Chamisa, Tendai Biti, David Coulthard, all these guys are not going to implement even one meaningful democratic reform in Zimbabwe. They are participating in these elections, knowing fully well that ZANU-PF is rigging these elections. But they are after their share of the spoils of power. And I think this country, Zimbabwe, if we are going to change it, we will have to accept the reality that ZANU-PF, as much as ZANU-PF cannot implement reforms and reform itself out of office, the opposition are not going to implement any meaningful reforms either, because if they did, they would have done it during the GNU. And now they are powerless to do it. All they're doing is participating for their share of the spoils of power. They realize ZANU-PF needs the opposition to participate to give the regime the resemblance that Zimbabwe is a multi-party democracy. And as long as they get that cut, they will participate in these elections. We can cry foul all we want. ZANU-PF has failed to even produce something as basic as a verified voters roll. Tendai Biti and Nelson Chamisa, if you were to ask them now, they will say, oh no, that is not right. Yeah, we want a verified voters roll. But if you were to ask, even, what about if it's not produced? Will you participate? If they answer you at all, they will tell you, yes, they will participate. Because they will participate. Because they have participated in the past without a verified voters roll. We have got to wake up to the reality. The Al Jazeera gold mafia, the one thing it is showing is how desperate this ZANU-PF regime is. It is digging deep, selling everything of value the regime can lay its hands on for the sake of raising enough money to bribe the various officials in ZEG, the police, the army, and most important of all, the opposition, just to stay in power. No nation can afford this reckless spending. And I think we owe it ourselves to stand up and say, no, this must stop, and stop it. Food for thought. Thank you and good night.